On the morning of August 15, 1945, the Japanese emperor addressed his people by radio for the first time in history. The voice was soft, the living voice of a god descending from the heavens to announce surrender. People wept in the streets of Tokyo. Champagne corks popped in Washington. In Nuremberg, they were already building the gallows for those who had dared put science in the service of death. The world was celebrating the end of an era where human beings could be reduced to expendable raw material. But at that exact moment, as the emperor's radio waves washed over scorched cities, 200 miles north of Harbin, deep in the Manchurian steppe, one man was barking his final orders. He methodically burned the documents, then the buildings, then the witnesses. General Shiro Ishii was obliterating the only scientific institution in the world that knew more about disease and death than any other entity on the planet. And he understood perfectly well that this knowledge was worth far more than his own life. The only question was, who would be the first to make him an offer? 4,000 miles away from Manchuria, that very question was already being discussed in Washington. To understand exactly what the Americans bought and at what price, you first have to understand what Unit 731 actually was. Not what it looked like from the outside, but what it was on the inside. From the air, the Pingfong complex looked like a small city. 2.5 square miles of buildings, roads, warehouses, and labs, surrounded by 3 rows of high-voltage barbed wire. Inside the perimeter, they had their own power plant, a rail spur, a private airfield, residential blocks for the staff, a school for their children, a swimming pool, a cinema, and 2 bars. On weekends, doctors and military officers played baseball on a manicured field. Families had picnics. Children rode bicycles down the neat, tree-lined avenues between the lab buildings.
And on Monday morning, the men put on their white coats and went to work. The facility's official name sounded impeccably bureaucratic: the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. On paper, it was a public health agency. In reality, it was the largest biological weapons factory in human history, where living, breathing people served as the only acceptable raw material. They didn't call them people here. There was an official term: maruta. In Japanese, the word means log. The psychological mechanism was simple and monstrously effective. If you weren't cutting open a human being, but merely sawing a log, you weren't committing a crime. You were doing science. The complex's monthly accounting ledgers looked like inventory invoices from a lumber mill. Received, 150 units of maruta. Disposed of this quarter, 128. Balance, 22. 22 human beings who were still breathing at the end of the quarter, logged neatly in the column for carryover stock.
Over the years of the unit's existence, anywhere from 3 to 10,000 people passed through Pingfong. Chinese peasants caught in sweeps, Soviet POWs, Koreans, Mongolians, even a few American pilots shot down over Manchuria. Not a single one walked out the gates alive. The research program covered absolutely everything that could kill a human being quickly, slowly, or agonizingly. Plague, cholera, anthrax, typhus, dysentery. Live cultures were cultivated in live hosts. Aerosol dispersion methods were perfected. Lethal doses were meticulously calibrated. They studied frostbite. People were marched out into the freezing Siberian winter, and their arms were doused with ice water until the limbs turned to stone. Then they measured the speed of necrosis, photographing the results every 20 minutes. They studied the effects of extreme pressure, locking people in hyperbaric chambers and recording the exact moment their eyeballs popped out of their sockets. They performed vivisections without anesthesia. The doctors rationalized this by claiming that sedatives would compromise the purity of the biological data. Everything was documented: photographs, schematics, charts, exhaustive descriptions of every protocol, thousands of pages of data that were absolutely impossible to obtain through any other means, because no civilized nation on Earth would ever allow such experimental conditions to be replicated. And that is exactly what made General Ishii's files priceless. When the Quantum Army capitulated, U.S. military intelligence had roughly 72 hours before Soviet units rolled into Manchuria and started their own hunt for the documents. Colonel Murray Sanders, a microbiologist from Fort Detrick, the U.S. Army's premier biological warfare center, boarded a military transport and flew to Tokyo with one specific mission: find the men of Unit 731 and figure out exactly what they had managed to create.
Sanders was a scientist, not an interrogator. He didn't know how to break people in a questioning room, didn't speak Japanese, and had zero experience dealing with war criminals. But he didn't need it. By that time, General Ishii had already returned to Tokyo and was calmly waiting to be contacted. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't running, he wasn't preparing to commit seppuku like so many of his peers. He understood the geopolitical landscape better than most Japanese warlords, who were busy scrambling for cyanide capsules or lining up for the gallows. Ishii knew he had a product, and that meant he had the leverage to negotiate. When Sanders showed up for their first meeting, the general greeted him politely, offered him tea, and didn't bother pretending he had nothing to hide. He simply slid a few pages from his diaries across the table. It was a meticulously calculated gesture. Not a confession, not a surrender. It was a product demo for a potential buyer.
Sanders read slowly, page after page. He backtracked several times. And as he read, he realized he was holding something that possessed infinite value on the global scientific market. The frostbite data had been obtained under conditions no Western university could ever replicate. Exact temperature thresholds at which irreversible tissue damage began. The progression rate of necrosis mapped against surface area, age, BMI, and baseline cardiovascular health. Rewarming methods with documented outcomes. What worked, what killed the patient faster, what left a man alive but without arms. This was knowledge that could save thousands of American GIs in any future campaign in Korea or Siberia. The anthrax and plague data detailed aerosolized deployment mechanisms with a precision that Western science wouldn't achieve on its own for decades. Sanders put the papers down. He looked at Ishii. He asked how many more documents existed. Ishii smiled. There were plenty. The negotiations took a few months. In diplomatic terms, a mere blink of an eye. Washington received a brief memo detailing the available data and asked the only question that mattered: is this valuable enough to justify violating the logic of Nuremberg? The military experts answered unequivocally, yes. The State Department hesitated. Military intelligence didn't hesitate for a second. The final terms of the deal were obscenely simple. The U.S. received all surviving research data, roughly 15,000 pages of reports, protocols, and photographic evidence. In exchange, Ishii and his inner circle received absolute immunity from prosecution. No trials, no public indictments, no mention of the deal in any unclassified records. General Douglas MacArthur signed the corresponding paperwork himself. The list of names quietly scrubbed from the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal docket numbered in the dozens. The tribunal's investigators received a verbal directive. The topic of Unit 731 is closed. Do not ask questions. The prosecutors complied.
The world, celebrating Nuremberg as the triumph of civilization over barbarism, knew absolutely nothing about what was happening simultaneously in Tokyo. While doctors in Germany were hanging from the gallows for human experimentation, the exact same kind of doctors in Japan were being quietly ushered out the back door and sent home, with new papers and unspoken guarantees of immunity. But the world did find out, just not immediately, and not from American sources. In 1949, in the city of Khabarovsk, the Soviets held a public war crimes trial for 12 Japanese servicemen captured in Manchuria. Among the defendants were officers who had worked directly at Pingfang. On the stand, they gave exhaustive testimony. They detailed the layout of the labs. They named their colleagues.
They talked about the live human plague experiments, about dropping infected fleas over Chinese villages in field tests, about how many people died within the first 48 hours, and exactly how it was logged in the workbooks. Foreign journalists were in the courtroom. Transcripts were published. For the first few days, several Western outlets ran detailed dispatches. The U.S. government's reaction followed within 48 hours. The State Department issued an official statement. The Khabarovsk trial was crude Soviet propaganda, a tool of the Cold War. The confessions were coerced and had no bearing on reality. Western newsrooms, receiving the signal, fell into line and dropped the story. Journalists who tried to keep digging hit a brick wall of sealed archives, silent sources, and editors who had suddenly lost all interest. In doing so, the United States government publicly branded as a lie the exact same information it was describing as documented fact in its own classified memos. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't ignorance. It was a conscious, calculated, cold-blooded choice. Meanwhile, the ping-pong data was en route to Fort Detrick, Maryland. What happened to the men who did all this? Nothing bad.
General Shiro Ishii went home to a quiet private residence in Tokyo. He occasionally consulted for American military specialists, unofficially, off the books, through intermediaries. He spoke at a few closed-door seminars. He wrote a few papers that were never published under his name. He died peacefully of throat cancer in 1959, at the age of 67, surrounded by his family. His neighbors knew him as a sweet, retired old doctor. Masaji Kitano, the unit's second-in-command, went on to become the president of the Green Cross, one of Japan's largest pharmaceutical corporations, specializing in blood products. The company supplied hospitals nationwide for decades. Several of the unit's doctors successfully defended dissertations at top Japanese universities. When colleagues asked about the source of their experimental data, the word human in the texts had been neatly replaced with the phrase Manchurian monkeys. The peer reviewers understood. The academic boards understood. The dissertations were accepted. The degrees were awarded. The scientific community stayed dead silent because the data was spectacular, the methodology was flawless, and nobody wanted to officially ask exactly how that data had been harvested.
One of the unit's doctors later chaired a department at a Tokyo medical university, lecturing students on the principles of evidence-based medicine. And this is where things get profoundly uncomfortable. Because the data bought with immunity for war criminals didn't just gather dust in a vault, it was put to work. The frostbite research was integrated into the cold weather injury treatment standards that the U.S. Army utilized as early as the Korean War, when thousands of GIs were losing fingers and toes in the freezing mountains. The anthrax protocols influenced American biodefense programs. Some of the data eventually bled into civilian medicine, through military journals, through dissertations with obfuscated citations, through word of mouth at closed-door conferences. Which means this.
The knowledge harvested at the cost of thousands of human lives on the Manchurian steppe ultimately became woven into the fabric of global medical science. Some of it is being used right now in the treatment protocols for severe frostbite, in plague defense principles, in combat medicine standards. The doctor who correctly rewarms a frostbitten limb today and saves a patient from amputation is relying on medical guidelines built upon a foundation that, buried deep down beneath layers of citations and adaptations, rests directly on those files from Pingfang. A full declassification of the American archives regarding Unit 731 never happened, neither in the 20th nor the 21st century. Some of the documents remain sealed to this day. What exactly is in them is anyone's guess. Maybe just the boring bureaucratic minutia of the deal, or maybe something else. They built a system of international justice that no force on earth was supposed to break. The Nuremberg principles, the tribunals, the procedures, it all looked like an impenetrable fortress. But they forgot that every fortress has a gate, and that gates are always guarded by men. And men, when offered a sufficiently valuable commodity, will always find a reason why, right now, in this specific case, the rules can be bent. For the greater good, for national security, for the future lives that will be saved. A noble motive can always be found. It is always found. The safe wasn't blown open with dynamite. It was unlocked from the inside. And now, the ultimate question, the one history never truly answered. If in 1945 you were holding those files in your hands, and you knew that the data inside could, in a few years, save thousands of your own soldiers' lives, but that it was bought with the blood of thousands of innocent people, and you knew the only alternative was to burn it to ashes to preserve the moral purity of the tribunal, what would you choose? Justice or survival? And is there really any difference between the two when the entity sitting at the negotiating table isn't a human being, but a state?